putting Sarasota on the book tour, thanks to Kira, who's with an Art Revolution group in South Florida. Woo! And so, you know, what we learned, Jeff is one of us, right? In 1986, he was arrested for disorderly conduct on the campus of Boston University. He sued the university for the right to hang banners outside the student dormitories, right? It was the anti-apartheid era, and they were working on that issue, and so he wasn't going to stand up for suppression of his freedom of speech. His first job with Bernie Sanders, he was Bernie's driver. You know, and he got to know Bernie pretty well, and obviously he's been with him for a long time. He ran twice for elected office, the first time at the age of 21 for an alderman seat in St. Albans, Vermont, and then he ran for mayor as an independent and received 40% of the vote. He started working as a legislative assistant to Bernie at his House office while attending law school at Georgetown, and he served as Bernie's House Chief of Staff in the early 2000s, as his 2006 campaign manager, and his Senate Chief of Staff from January 2007 to July 2009. And of course, we all know he was called upon by Bernie to serve as his 2016 campaign manager for the presidential campaign that got so many of us active and engaged. And we are thrilled to have him here tonight. Please welcome Jeff Weaver.
I'm in one of those movies where someone's trying to stand up for the first time. Listen, I want to thank you all for having me here, and I want to congratulate all of you as a progressive community here in Sarasota. This facility is phenomenal. I go all over the country and see progressive groups, and there are a number of places where there are progressive spaces, but this one is phenomenal. The fact that you have a radio station, incredible, and I am certain that it is due to the hard work of I think Trump has control of the lights and the microphone. I just want to congratulate you because this is not the norm in most places, and you should feel grateful for having a space like this. So. Let me forward this. This is my first gig. How's that? Oh, maybe it made it looser. Well, maybe I'll take it out of this thing and just hold it. That might be better. How's that, everybody? There we go, we'll go low tech. Listen, when this book tour was organized, we obviously didn't know what was going to happen in the Florida primary. And I thought it might be a little bit sleepy, and I'd come down here and sort of pep people up from a difficult primary day. And who would know that Florida would shock the nation and nominate Andrew Gillum. I met Andrew Gillum not that long ago when I was down speaking at the Democratic State Convention, and incredibly inspiring, a person who really has a bold vision of big solutions for big problems here in Florida. And I got to tell you that this race is now being watched by the nation, and I think it's fair to say that this is the marquee race in the midterm elections. Somehow you all in Florida always find a way to put yourself at the center of politics in America. If I didn't know better, I'd think it was intentional, but I'm told that it's not. But the nation is watching, and you are going to show the nation that in a quote-unquote purple state, that an unabashed progressive can go toe-to-toe with a Trump troll who has resorted to racist attacks and is carrying the torch for the Trump counter-revolution in America. And you're going to show that an unabashed progressive can win in that environment. So there's a lot of weight on your shoulders in terms of turning this country around, because what happens here will feed a larger narrative that will go into the 2020 presidential election cycle, and will have a tremendous impact not only on the country but on the direction of the Democratic Party in 2020. If we can win here, that means we can win everywhere in this country, from coast to coast. So it's a big burden on you, but based on the people I've met so far on this trip, I'm very confident that we're going to have a victory here in November. So, So this is ostensibly a book tour, but I do, go and speak to progressive groups, and I know a lot of folks. I do encourage you to buy the book, and I'll talk a little bit about the book. But I also want to talk about what's going on in this country, a little bit about our movement and its place in the mainstream of American politics. Frankly, despite what you hear from DeSantis and even some people with a D after their name, you all in this room and folks all across this country are carrying on a proud tradition that formed the foundation of the modern Democratic Party and led to its dominance in national politics for decades before we went off the rails in the 1990s. And you all are the people who are taking us back to our roots that are going to rebuild this party so that it is capable of winning in every zip code in America. I want to start by reading just an excerpt from this book. And the excerpt is the 1944 State of the Union address by Franklin Delano Roosevelt that he delivered in the waning days of World War II, in which he lays out what has now been called a Second Bill of Rights for this country, and really lays out a blueprint for the unfinished business of the New Deal and the mission of the modern Democratic Party. And as long as our party has stuck to this mission, we have been successful, and we have strayed from it. We have seen electoral failure. And so I also want to, again, place us where we belong. We are the sort of mainstream of progressive thinking in America that arose in the early 20th century of this country. I should say that my editor, when I insisted on putting this in, said, no, don't put that in there. It's too dense, too long, it's too much reading. People won't want to read it. And I told them, if there's anything to read in this book, they should read this page and a half. And so it is in here, thankfully. If you're not buying the book, and you don't have to buy your book to find this, it's online in many places. But I think it really speaks to not only the work that we are trying to do, but also has some very prescient warnings of what happens if we don't accomplish the mission of carrying out this agenda, which is extremely relevant to the world that we are facing here in the U.S. Right now. So I'd like to read this. It is about a page and a half. I will read it gingerly so we can get through it, but I think it is important for folks to hear what FDR said in the State of the Union address. He says, "It is our duty now to begin to lay the plans and determine the strategy for winning of a lasting peace and the establishment of an American standard of living higher than ever before known. We cannot be content, no matter how high that general standard of living may be, if some fraction of our people, whether it be 1/3 or 1/5 or 1/10, is ill-fed, ill-clothed, ill-housed, and insecure. This republic had its beginning and grew to its present strength under the protection of certain inalienable political rights, among them the right of free speech, free press, free worship, trial by jury, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. These were our rights to life and liberty. As our nation has grown in size and stature, however, as our industrial economy expanded, these political rights proved inadequate to assure us equality in the pursuit of happiness. We have come to a clear realization of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. Necessitous men are not free men. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made. In our day, these economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. We have accepted, so to speak, a second Bill of Rights under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station, race, or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return that will give him and his family a decent living, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment, the right to a good education. All of these rights spell security, and after this war is won, we must be prepared to move forward in the implementation of these rights to new goals of human happiness and well-being. America's own rightful place in the world depends in large part upon how fully these and similar rights, bless you, have been carried into practice for our citizens. For unless there is security here at home, there cannot be lasting peace in the world. And I want to read this last paragraph, and this is sort of the prescient warning that has so much relevance today. One of the great American industrialists of our day, a man who has rendered yeoman service to his country in this crisis, recently emphasized the grave dangers of rightist reaction in this nation. All clear-thinking businessmen share his concern. Indeed, if such reaction should develop, if history were to repeat itself and we were to return to the so-called normalcy of the 1920s, that it is certain that even though we shall have conquered our enemies on the battlefields abroad, we shall have yielded to the spirit of fascism here at home. And that, my friends, unfortunately, is where we find ourselves today. The same unfinished business that all of you are fighting for day in and day out, knocking on doors. The same agenda and unfinished work that Bernie Sanders talked about in 2016, that Andrew Gillum is talking about here in Florida in 2018, that candidates all across the country are talking about. Ben Jealous running for governor in Maryland, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, and candidates all across the country who have decided that they are going to help return us home to the unfinished business of the New Deal. On the other side, we have Trump and his compatriots whose job is to fill the coffers of the wealthy at the expense of working families and communities through the use of division and fomentation of hatred against people who are different than we are. And we cannot allow that to happen in this country. I want to talk a little bit about what happened to us in the 1990s, because I think all of you are sort of aware of it on a surface level, about how we lost our way and what it has meant for the Democratic Party and its relationship to its historical base in this country, and why we ended up in the place we are today. That labor has traditionally formed a core constituency of the Democratic Party. And as the neoliberal forces swept into power in the 1992 election, that relationship was shattered by the free trade policies of the Clinton administration, NAFTA, most favored nation status with China and others. That represented a break that has yet to be healed in this party, and has made both the Democratic Party and labor weaker. As you all know, labor is quite on the ropes with a conservative Supreme Court that's about to get more conservative, and a failure of Democrats to full-throatedly articulate a pro-labor message. The result of that break was that the Democratic Party lost the House of Representatives in 1994 to the Gingrich counter-revolution for the first time since 1952. And the response to that, instead of understanding the failure of these anti-worker policies, was to engage in a kind of triangulation against the most vulnerable members of our Democratic coalition, including communities of color with the crime bill and the so-called welfare reform bill, which was really a sort of watered-down version of Ronald Reagan's thinly veiled racist welfare queen attacks that had taken place in the 80s. And an attack on the LGBT community in the form of DOMA, which Bill Clinton and his campaign proudly featured on Christian radio throughout the South during the 1996 presidential re-election. This led to a crisis in our party where many people begin to view the Democratic Party as not as a vehicle for change or a vehicle for uplifting marginalized communities and working people in this country. And you saw that in the 2016 race. And in my view, to sort of understand the race, everything happens in a historical moment. And our campaign, and your work in that campaign, was an effort to move away from this rightward drift in the Democratic Party, to move us back to our historical roots, the unfinished business that I discussed in FDR's State of the Union address, and to once again make us a party whose goal is to create more equality, more inclusion, and more democracy in this country. And this is the hard work that we're doing. And I got to tell you, and Bernie always says to me, he goes, "Oh, you're going on your book trip. You got to tell people this." And so I will tell you this. It just comes straight from Bernie. He said, "Please tell people we are winning." You know, when you watch the news and you see anonymous people in the White House putting out New York Times op-ed pieces that talks about the chaos and dysfunction, to put it lightly, in the White House today, it is, and when you see, you know, a very conservative, arch-conservative being pushed onto the Supreme Court while, you know, tens of thousands of pages of documents related to him are withheld from the Congress. When you see all these things happen, when you see young children torn from their mother's arms and thrown into cages by our own government, many of whom will never be reunited with their children, and some we know have already been subjected to sexual abuse, it is difficult to believe that things are getting better and can get better. But they are, and it is showing up in places like Florida and in Georgia and in Maryland and in New York, and we just saw in Massachusetts and all across this country. And the issues that you have championed, that Bernie Sanders has championed, Medicare for all, you should know, and I want to thank him very much today, that President Obama, in his speech today, endorsed Medicare for all. And, you know, he understands, you know, despite the attacks that we took in 2016, that Medicare for all was somehow an affront to the Affordable Care Act, you know, which was a signature accomplishment of the Obama administration. What we knew then, what we know now, and what President Obama has acknowledged is that each generation of progressives builds on the accomplishments of the prior generation. Our progressive vision, our progressive agenda will not be accomplished in 5 years or 10 years. It is a constant struggle, and we will struggle, and we at each point will get as much as we can to help uplift people in this country. And then it will be incumbent on future generations to go even further. But their work will not be a repudiation of the work that we have all done, but rather the fulfillment of our long-term vision about building a better and more equal America. So I want to thank the President for that, and I do call him the President because we have what we have in the White House right now. And you know, as I describe it, and relating it back to what FDR said, you know, this country really is resting on the edge of a knife. In 2020, there is no guarantee that Trump will be defeated. He will have enormous resources to run his campaign. The payback that will come from the trillions of dollars which he has given the very wealthy in this country and large corporations, those folks want to protect those gains. The amount of money that they will spend to protect them from Bernie Sanders or from some other progressive candidate in 2020 will be enormous. It will be spending like you have never seen before in this country. So 2020 is not going to be a cakewalk. It is going to require more work than any of us have ever done. It will be a more intense campaign than ever before. Clearly, foreign interference that we saw in 2016 will be multiplied exponentially. And it is going to be the responsibility of people like the people in this room, frankly, and I hate to put this burden on you after I just given you the burden of electing Andrew Gillum all by yourself, to talk to your neighbors, to do the door-to-door work that is needed to validate whoever it is that we are supporting in 2020. And, you know, for the record, Bernie has not decided, so this is not a veiled Bernie speech. I mean that quite honestly. But the responsibility that we have all taken on by the work that we are doing is great. You know, our Western allies in the beginning of the 20th century confronted similar situation, and they failed internally in their countries to resolve it. And it led to a tremendous sacrifice, not only for them, but for what we call America's generation, and for people all over this world, because they failed to stand up and defeat the rightist movements in their country. Trump is a horrendous president with horrendous policies that are hurting people left and right. But he's not the worst that it can get. It can get worse. And if we don't stop them now, what will happen with the next Trump, he will be worse than this Trump. And we can go down into a very, very dangerous place that I think none of us want to see. We want to build an America that is united, not one that is divided by Trump and people like him, with the effect that many people in this country will increasingly see their standard of living decline, and we will continue to see marginalized communities victimized by policies that are keeping them down. But in the vein of winning, President Obama today came out for Medicare for All. I don't know if you all saw a poll recently. 80% of Democrats support Medicare for all. 52% of Republicans support Medicare for all. This idea of a $15 minimum wage is sweeping the nation. It's winning in ballots on red states. The idea of free tuition at public colleges and universities, which I have to tell you is not some idea that we took from Scandinavia or Europe. This used to be the reality in the United States of America. And we have got to, again, like with FDR's State of the Union, we need to return to our roots and make a higher education attainable for all Americans, regardless of what zip code they come from in this country. And it is incredibly gratifying to me. One of the great modern civil rights movements, Black Lives Matter, has brought to the attention of the nation, and I have to say, as you know, they demonstrated at many of our events in 2016 to highlight the issues that they were concerned about, and I, in all honesty, I say in my book, as a campaign manager, it made my life very complicated. But we, met with Black Lives Matter activists throughout the country at rally after rally in small groups and meetings with Bernie and myself and others, because as you know, Black Lives Matter is not an organization, it's a movement. And so you need to interact with activists in every community that you come into, which was a great strength for them. It created difficulty for us because it was, organizations are used to interacting with other organizations, but as a movement, we had to, understand the best way to interact with these primarily young activists who were raising the nation's attention to the fact that young people of color in particular were being gunned down in the streets of our country and unfortunately continue to be gunned down. But I've got to tell you, it is so gratifying that the work of these young people, the issue of criminal justice reform, of police violence, is now on the radar screen of every American in this country. During the 2016 race, it was incredible to see Bernie talking to crowds across the country, and we obviously went to many places. But even when the crowd was largely white, there was no larger applause line than the one for criminal justice reform in this country. And again, Florida is on the front line with Amendment 4 on the ballot coming up in November. We have got to restore the rights of people who have paid their dues to society. Making somebody essentially a non-citizen after they have done their time is insane. It is obviously, as it's been characterized as the new Jim Crow, as you know, and we have got to put an end to it in Florida and all across this country. And there's a lot of talk about, I want to talk about immigration reform because this is obviously a point that the president uses quite often with his false rhetoric about open borders and so on and so forth. This country was built by many people, many of whom, certainly Europeans who came here because they were looking to increase the sort of economic welfare of their family. That's why Europeans came here. Our African American brothers and sisters were brought here against their will, but also have done yeoman's work to build this country without the compensation and the recognition that they deserve. And so now we have modern immigrants who are coming to America who are looking to build a better life for their families. And I have to tell you that the kind of demagoguery and demonization of people who are looking to escape religious persecution, war, economic deprivation, who come here to work hard to build a life for their children's future is really one of the most disgusting aspects of the Trump talking points in this country. And the attempt to drive a wedge between working people in this country, it has always been a tactic of the right and of the corporatist agenda, and Trump has taken it to a new level. And I hope everyone here agrees, and I'm sure we do in this progressive space, that we have got to bring our brothers and sisters out of the shadows in this country. We have to have a path to citizenship, and we need a sane immigration policy in this country. Because at the end of the day, we are going to win, and the reason we are winning, and why I'm so proud to be part of a movement that has leaders like Andrew Gillum, that has leaders like Stacey Abrams, that has leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ben Jealous, is this is a movement for all people in this country. We are building a multiracial, progressive movement that it can be a home for everyone whose leadership can come from every community. You know, you can read in my book about the sort of mythical Bernie bros and how the Bernie campaign was only supported by 21-year-old white boys who didn't like women, didn't like racial minorities, attacked people viciously online. In fact, there's an interesting survey that was done in here that didn't get much attention during the course of the campaign about a poll of people online about who had the most obnoxious followers online and harassing followers. Trump's people won, they won pretty handily. In second place was Hillary Clinton's followers, followed by Ted Cruz, followed by Bernie Sanders. But this myth developed, and it was obviously perpetuated by our opponents who were looking for it as a talking point. And it came to such a head that our young supporters of color, and all the research is clear that Bernie won millennials of every race throughout the political campaign, became so disgusted by the attempt by the Clinton campaign and the media, frankly, to whitewash our progressive movement in state after state, that they went on a line with a hashtag, Bernie made me white. I don't know if you all remember the Bernie made me white hashtag, but it was young people of color who were disgusted about how they were essentially being erased from the process during 2016. And like I said, I'm very gratified that we have diverse movement, but we also have diverse leadership in our movement that is a clear demonstration to everybody that this progressive movement can be a home for everybody in this country. I do want to open it up for questions in a little bit. Whoops, look at that. She's eager. She's eager with a question. But I do want to end with this, and I'm happy to take questions and I'll sign people's books at the end. I do have to be on the phone with Bernie a little bit later, so the work of the political revolution continues. But I do want to, again, because Bernie will say, did you tell him twice? So I will tell you twice. We are winning, ladies and gentlemen. We are winning in this country. There is a thirst among people in this country for leadership that is capable of uniting Americans, that is capable of addressing the big problems that people are facing in their everyday lives. We hear all about all these macro statistics. The stock market's doing great, the unemployment rate's low, people have jobs, many people have 3 jobs. But wages in this country and productivity, productivity in this country has soared. If wages had kept up with productivity in this country, you all would be very, very wealthy people. And so we have got to deal with talk about the real problems that real families face. We all know people, I'm sure many people in this room, who work hard every day, who may have multiple jobs, who just are not getting ahead. They're having a hard time paying their bills. They don't know how they're going to send their kids to college. They don't know how they're going to make sure that their aging parents have a retirement that's a retirement in dignity, that they can pay for the long-term medical care that folks need. Many people lost their houses in the 2008 Great Recession. People are still trying to dig out from that. And when they were bailing out the corporations, they certainly did not bail out everyday Americans. So a lot of Americans are hurting, and they're looking for leadership. Trump has put out a very radical vision of America, right? Not really a kleptocracy of his friends. He wanted to drain the swamp, but his administration, frankly, is populated by the biggest swamp creatures of any Republican administration that has ever existed. And they want to maintain their position by dividing all of us up, by making us hate one another. They want you to hate anybody who is not just like you. And we have got to offer the leadership to counter that. The American people, I wouldn't be involved in politics if I did not have faith that the American people are better than that. They are looking for leadership, and that is going to come from our movement. Within the Democratic Party, outside the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party is rapidly moving in our direction. The progressive wing is rapidly becoming the whole bird. We had a major victory last weekend when the Democratic National Committee, by a vote of 3-1, voted to eliminate superdelegates from the nominating process and to enact a whole host of other reforms. And that happened because people at the grassroots stood up and said, we want to pick the nominee of our party. We don't need party insiders telling us what to do. So we are winning in so many ways, in the party, in the public mind, in the public debate, and in elections. So keep it up. This is not the time to lean back and rest on our laurels. This is the time to lean in, lean your shoulder in and keep fighting because there is a better America that's possible, and we together are going to make that happen. So thank you very much. And I'm happy.
All right, we're going to wait for the talking stick. If you have a question, I'm going to come to you with the microphone so everyone can hear you. Did you have something else?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, to sort of, I know sometimes people want to elaborate on their question. If you could sort of make them kind of pithy, and I will try to keep my answers from droning on, and we'll get through as many people as we can.
Yeah, and before we get to that, because some of you may check out early, I want to introduce a few folks that are in the House that will maybe be on your ballot in November. Well, first, someone who was on your ballot in August, I want you to recognize Nick Guy, who runs Wesley Ann Beggs, running for County Commissioner. Crystal Orr, running for a Charter Review Board in the back of the House. All Bernie people. We want to look for them. We also have Mindy Simmons running for Charter Review Board. A Bernie person, Mindy, on your ballot. Who else do we have on their ballot, Deanie, that I should mention? Ruta Giuliani is on your ballot also for County Commission. Not here tonight, right? But she was with us. So, all right, just wanted to get them in before. Did I miss anybody? Tracy Pratt, yeah, sorry guys. Tracy doesn't have a lot of Sarasota in her district, but District 71 in North Sarasota is in her District 71. All right, here we go. First question.
Hillary won the popular vote, and then the Electoral College gave the election to Trump. So can we, she won by millions of votes. How can we overcome that?
Well, so I don't, first of all, let me just a disclaimer. So as you all know, Bernie and myself both actively supported Secretary Clinton in the general election. I was on TV for her all over the country. Bernie traveled the country for her, including in many states that she chose not to go to. And I made, I have warm, actually, professional relationships with many people who were top people in the Clinton campaign who I got to know during the course of the general election. And so I'm not big on Monday morning quarterbacking them, although there were serious problems with their campaign, because I ran a campaign. Believe me, I made plenty of mistakes. I could be, and I am Monday morning quarterbacked all the time about it. So, but what I would say to you is, what you do is you run a campaign that can get the most electoral votes, and that means going into working class communities in Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota. They almost lost by 1,100 votes, and Pennsylvania. You've got to speak to a broad range of Americans. I mean, one answer obviously is to change the Electoral College. It takes a constitutional amendment. But what I'm saying is, let's build a movement which is capable of winning everywhere in this country, and we will win the electoral votes we need to win to beat Trump.
About election fraud, I have two questions. Does a campaign like the one you ran have a way of knowing if the machines are being tampered, and what are the mechanisms for security so that doesn't happen?
Yeah, so the issue of election machine security, which is carried out primarily by local officials. I live in Virginia, where we used to have these really crazy machines with like dials and names moving up and down, and there was no paper record. And and at the end, when you pushed to vote, you'd vote, and a little flag would wave. And how they did a recount was they would have these machines tethered together, and they would push a button, and it would print out a report. And if you wanted to do a recount, what they would do is they would push the button again and print the report over again. This is how they did a recount. Although those machines have been abolished now, and there's a paper record, We have got to have a balloting system in every place that has a paper record so that you can go back through and look at the actual ballots that people cast or that were printed by the machine that people can verify. That is one way of dealing with this problem. Having machines where you push a button and there's some calculation that goes on over there in a box, and that the only way to do a recount is to push the button again, we can't have that anymore in America. And if it means going back to paper ballots, and that requires that election officials count till 3 a.m., I can wait a few more hours. I'm in politics. I love to hear the results immediately because I'm very anxious. But if it takes 3 a.m. or 5 a.m. to get the results, so be it. Let's get the right result and not just a result.
Jeff, in your opinion, what is the single most effective thing that we and our friends can do to win elections? Is it making phone calls? Is it going door to door? Is it something else?
Yes. So, look, what I would say is, there's a lot of studies done on what's most effective. The truth of the matter is, what is most effective is if you talk to somebody you know and validate a candidate, that's a very effective means of campaigning for somebody. To talk to your circle of friends because you ostensibly have some credibility with those people, and they will, give your considered opinion more weight than they will somebody else that they don't know. That being said, person-to-person contact is very important, whether it's on the doors, whether it's on the phones. There are different strokes for different folks. Some people love door knocking. Hate being on the phone. Some people love being on the phone. They hate going out and door knocking, or they can't go out and door knock. We ran very effectively in our campaign a system of distributed organizing where their computers were all hooked in, and they would get phone numbers and they were connected to a dialer, and you'd have people in California calling into Iowa or into Florida, and people in Florida calling it, as the sort of schedule went on. But I think what you have to do is all of those things, frankly. And for candidates, obviously a lot of voter contact is important. Voters like to look you in the eye. The fact that they've met you means a lot to voters, frankly. Bernie has probably met just about everybody in Vermont over the course of his tenure there. He and I used to travel the highways and byways and county fairs, and wherever there were 25 people together, I was there with Bernie and he was shaking hands. So I'm only half joking when I say, there's a huge percentage of Vermonters that actually have seen Bernie Sanders in person or met him. Now it's a state of only 600,000 people, but some of you run in districts that are not, that are smaller as well. Andrew Gillum obviously is not going to meet everybody face to face in a state this size and this many people, but local candidates can do that, and that's one of the powers that local candidates have, over more establishment candidates, is that they can go toe to toe in a local election where there's not a lot of TV air, cover overhead. Where you can just go and talk to your neighbors. So there's not one tactic that is proven to be, everybody has a theory about what the most effective tactic is, but in terms of voter-to-voter contact, it's about people talking to other people, and that's what we need to do. So do all of it.
Pleasure to have you talk, Jeff.
Thank you.
I was a Brody person in Alaska, so I lived in Alaska for 25 years. In 2016 I moved, but one of the things I think about is local the best way to get progressive candidates, because we see that Kavanaugh is probably going to be, on the Supreme Court. That's going to really mess everything up, but I feel pretty hopeless a lot of times, but I do see some hope in these. Do you think local is better, or should we be looking at the national scene too?
Well, look, I think we need, I tell this Democratic, the Democratic Party, it's given up on many parts of the country. They either don't run candidates or they don't support the candidates who are running in places that they perceive as quote unquote unwinnable. And I think we have got to put up candidates everywhere. Republicans will always have a monetary advantage over us, always. They represent the ruling class of this country. And you cannot let them have the luxury of concentrating that already considerable firepower in just a few locations, right? We have got to take the fight to them. We have to run in red places. And one of the surprising things, certainly to our opponents in the 2016 race, is Bernie won moderate Democrats. Bernie won the conservative vote, Democratic vote. He won rural Democrats. And Hillary was not winning those people. So a bold progressive message delivered in places that are quote unquote unwinnable and red is exactly what we need as an antidote to the Republicans. Working class people are hurting everywhere. We can't abandon these people to Republican administrations, which are doing great harm in a lot of states in this country to their most vulnerable citizens. And people are looking for a change. And too often from our party, they have heard a sort of like modulating, centrist, undefined sort of message. And look, we live in an increasingly virtual world, but people are looking for authentic leaders, even if they don't agree with every plank in their platform. Their BS meter is very sensitive, and so when candidates sort of like try to tack around the left to center, people just tune out because they don't want to be led by somebody who doesn't have the courage of his or her own convictions. So I think we need to run everywhere, up and down the ballot. That's the long answer to your excellent question.
I've got a son in St. Louis who's a moderate Republican, and he sort of felt like the party's left him. And so he's working and writing for 2 Democratic congressional candidates there. And his message to them is to go back. He mentioned FDR, that the Democrats and FDR really would live with capitalism as long as everyone got a fair share, as long as everyone got the rewards, labor, the government, and everything. So he calls it democratic capitalism. How do you respond to that?
Well, look, I would say this. Look, we have a market economy in this country. The question is whether the people who own the capital are going to control the country, right? We're always going to have a sort of market-driven economy, but we cannot have an economy where the fact that you are one of the 1% in this country means that you run the economic and political life of America. That is unacceptable. It has led to disastrous results. The greed of the people in that class has been exposed as obscene, given the deprivation we see in our own country. The wealthiest country, as Bernie says, in the history of the world, right? And so many people have so little. And Jeff Bezos, Bernie has been highlighting Jeff Bezos' role in the world in terms of paying his workers very little. His personal wealth is increasing. The figure I remember sounds astronomical, but I know it is astronomical. So you can all look it up on Bernie's website. But we cannot ignore the structural problems in our country, which has allowed so few to have so much, and the rest of us to have so little.
Yeah, I don't think his point was that. His point was that you might be able to reach some disaffected Republicans who think along those lines, or some independents who are more business oriented.
No, I think we are, and I think the truth is that there is a good chunk of the business community which is now coming around to the idea of Medicare for all, especially smaller businesses who find themselves year after year having to renegotiate insurance coverage for their employees. It's enormously expensive. It's draining the coffers of their companies. It's driving them crazy. And the idea of Medicare for all, where they would know with certainty what their payment's going to be in terms of their employees, they know their employees would have coverage, is a great relief for many small business people in this country. And so we're seeing a growing movement among small business people on this front. One of the difficulties you have is you have lobbies like the Chamber of Commerce in Washington, D.C., which represents all business interests, and there's like an understanding, which is no matter how much of an economic drag on the country the private health insurance industry is, and it's hurting many other industries. It's hurting small businesses, it is certainly hurting manufacturing. I mean, if you talk to executives at the auto industry, the amount of money they're spending on healthcare, like they all get it, but they have this understanding that we don't go after you and you won't go after us later on. And it is time for the business community to throw the private insurance company people out of their boat. And we'll all be better for it.
Thank you. Hi, Jeff. I was the volunteer treasurer for a U.S. congressional candidate about 14 years ago, and I had to familiarize myself with the McCain-Feingold Act.
Yeah.
So campaign finance reform has always been an issue with me, or it is an important issue to me. They gutted it, I mean, it's not dead like some people say, but they gutted it with PACs and then Citizens United, right, which is absurd. What are your views on the possibility of actually getting some real I want money out of politics. I don't want corporations to be people. I don't want any of that. I mean, obviously.
Right.
So, what are your thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, this Kavanaugh nomination to the Supreme Court, of course, is going to further reinforce support for Citizens United and similar kinds of views on the already super conservative Supreme Court. So in some ways, we're going a little bit backwards in that regard. I think what we have tried to do in 2016 was to run a campaign without that kind of money, obviously with a national platform and a national fundraising base. We were able to raise $230 million, $27 at a time, which is a lot of contributions if you think about it. Now, the problem is down ballot candidates often don't have that kind of exposure, don't have access to that kind of donor base, and so they have to rely on more traditional ways of fundraising. I mean, the truth of what would be in the best public interest would be if we had some system of public financing of elections. Elections will always cost money, and frankly, the truth of the matter is a society spends money on the things it values. And candidates talking to voters and reaching out to voters and having a discussion about the future of the country costs money. So, moneyless campaigns are never going to happen, and I would not support moneyless campaigns. So, I mean, essentially what you're going to do is the incumbents will always win if you have moneyless campaigns. But we need to level the playing field, and we need to provide a source of funding for people to run for office in the public interest and not the interest of donors. We want to make sure that people in every community, how many progressive candidates do we know, who have trouble raising money because they don't have networks of friends who are professionals, right? And it becomes very difficult to fundraise, particularly for races that are not high profile, even though these races are often more directly related to the quality of life of people's day-to-day lives. You know what I mean? So we need to have a public financing system in this country which allows people to run without groveling for money to rich people and allows people in every community to be able to run an effective campaign where they can communicate with voters.
I totally agree.
That's a ways down the road. We got some work to do
Will
on
I
that.
live long enough?
Maybe. I can't make. I'm not an actuary. I can't make those predictions.
We have a deficit of 38,000 voters registered, Democrat versus Republican in this county. What message are you seeing work to get the the Republicans that are fed up with the Trump side of things? What message are you seeing out there? So going into November, we can.
Yeah, I mean, what's the percentage of MPAs?
Was it 22%?
Yeah,
so I mean, the recent
It's in the
polling,
20s.
the Quinnipiac poll that just came out of Florida showed Andrew Gillum winning among independent voters or NPA voters. In the 2016 primary process, unlike Florida's sort of anomalous. Closed primaries are something that are rare in America. Most states have primaries where at least MPAs can participate in the Democratic primary process. Florida and Oregon have closed primaries, and then a handful of machine politics Democratic states in the Northeast have closed primaries. I mean, what we see, Bernie Sanders won independent voters who were participating in the Democratic primary process across the country by huge margins over Secretary Clinton, 3-1, 4-1 in some places. And so independent voters are very open to a progressive message. They have become disaffected. They don't like the Republican Party. They don't like the establishment of the Democratic Party because they, have not felt that the establishment of the Democratic Party is representing their interests. But they are open to a progressive message. And the other truth is a lot of these MPAs are young people. Over 50% of young people are registering as MPAs in this country. And closed primaries are locking them out of participation in Florida. If you allowed MPAs to vote in Florida elections, I bet Andrew Gillum would have won by 5 or 6 points, and not just by the margin that he had. So, I would reach out to NPA voters. I would bring out young voters, who are often what we call low propensity voters, like they're unlikely to vote in a given election, and to reach out to communities, typically poor communities, communities of color, where people are not participating. You've got to change the composition of the electorate. I mean, I'll tell you a story about this. We were in Iowa in the Iowa caucuses. Our pollster, unlike most modern pollsters, understood this dynamic, right? And so most people thought there'd be 135,000 people that would show up at the Iowa caucus. And that's what the Hillary people thought, and that's what most people thought. And we polled with the assumption that that would happen, and we would lose by 5 percentage points, right? If 170,000 people came out, we would lose by 2 points. If 190,000 people came out, we would win by 2 points. As it turns out, 180,000 came out, and it was right down the middle. And of course, the result was right down the middle. And it, in the book Shattered, which was about the Hillary campaign, they acknowledged that what they didn't understand is that all these new voters that were coming into the process, the difference between 135 and 180, those people were voting for Bernie Sanders, not 2-1 or 3-1, but like 8-1, 9-1, 10-1 for Bernie Sanders. So when you bring these new people into the process, the people that the pollsters aren't counting, that the party is not targeting, when you bring those people in, you can change the nature of the electorate, and then you create a much more favorable playing field for progressive candidates to win in. And that's what we did in Iowa and a number of other places in this country, and that's what people have to do all around, certainly around Florida. I mean, Andrew Gillum did that to great success in his race. There was a huge percentage of his voters who had not participated in the last 3 Democratic primaries. These were new voters coming into the process, some young, some people who were disaffected, but we need to bring those people out. And that requires work, because they're not voting for a reason. They're voting because they don't think it matters, or they don't think that the 2 parties that are there are representing their interests. And we have got to reach out to people. We got to knock on their doors. We got to register them to vote. We got to encourage them to come out. We got to have those GOTV phone calls apropos of what's the most effective thing. And on voting day, you got to be calling people on the phone. You got to make it easy for people to vote. And so that's what I would say to you: is change the nature of the electorate, and we can win.
I'd just like to say, first of all, that democratic capitalism is an oxymoron. And we had about 240 years of that. It was called slavery. And my question is, the situation with the flag and the so-called national anthem is incredibly important in African American communities. The votership, voter turnout in African American communities should be 100%.
Absolutely, absolutely.
One of the main reasons that doesn't occur is because the very symbols that represent this country and the whole psychological and emotional undergirdings of the society really undermine everything that African Americans experience on a daily basis. So I'd like to know what Bernie's position would be with regards to the flag and the national anthem controversy, specifically related to the Colin Kaepernick and professional athletes kind of coterie around it. Because these people, professional athletes and entertainers, are incredibly important role models in African American communities.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And this situation is going to be substantial in African American communities going forward.
Yeah, Bernie and I have sort of similar origins in politics. We both came out of sort of protest movements. He came out of the civil rights protest movement in Chicago. I'm sure you've all seen the picture of Bernie chained up and then thrown into a police car. And I was arrested in the anti-apartheid movement in Boston University in the 80s. And the way that Trump contemptuously treats people who are engaged in respectful civil disobedience at sporting events and other places is just part of his program of trying to divide people up. It's not a secret that there's a lot of working class people of all races who watch and enjoy sports, and this is just another way that he is trying to cleave, put a wedge between African Americans and white working class people and other people who are watching these events. So we have got to protect the First Amendment rights of people who are engaged in the kind of respectful protest that we have seen at the sporting events around this country. The demonization of, it's primarily young men who we watch in professional sports, of young men who are offering a knee in protest or kneeling down to protest discrimination in this country, police violence in this country, inequity in this country. I think is, again, just another part of the Republicans' disgraceful attempt to divide Americans up. So we need to be supportive of peaceful protest. People will remember, you know, in 2016 when Bernie was experiencing protests at his own rallies, like, as I mentioned, by Black Lives Matter activists who were trying to highlight the issue of police violence in this country. You know, Trump was on stage mocking Bernie for not treating the protesters, you know, in a violent way, and we never did do that. You know, we obviously didn't want our rallies interrupted, as you could probably understand, but there was a respect for what these young people were trying to do. We tried to build bridges with people, and that's what you do in a movement that's an intersectional movement like ours is to build bridges with people who have different backgrounds and different experiences, and that's how we lift communities up. You treat people with respect who are trying to bring attention to what is a very serious systemic problem in this country. And so I guess that would be my answer to you. Was that?
Well,
Go ahead.
It sort of addresses it. For instance, I haven't sang the so-called U.S. national anthem or saluted the U.S. flag in 50 years. Since I just stopped in junior high school. It's nothing new, but it's nothing new in African American communities. There are many African Americans who simply feel like it's not a flag for them. The African Americans have been oppressed under the stars and bars as much as they've been oppressed under the stars and stripes. I mean, there's not a whole lot of difference. We had no say-so in selecting this flag. We had no say-so in selecting a national anthem. It doesn't belong to us. I mean, it's not, it didn't come out of our experience. And the things that do are the things that we tout. And the duality of life in African American communities is something that cannot continue if there's going to be a oneness among Americans. I mean, essentially, African Americans on a daily basis live that dual life. And until that is not necessary, then there's not going to be togetherness. It's simply not going to happen. And the symbols that the country supports and literally forces on people has a lot to do with that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate hearing your perspective, and I hope we can all work together to build a country that we can all be proud of.
Jeff, I'm wondering, looking back 2 years, just how solid the Trump vote was. And let me just tell you a little anecdote. 2 years ago, I asked a lot of
Speak more directly into the mic.
Okay, 2 years ago, I asked a lot of people down in Venice and how their friends were going to vote, because you don't necessarily ask them directly that. And many people, the eyes glazed over, and they said, "Well, I'm not voting for Hillary." Well, of course, then there was only one choice, wasn't there? And then I'd say, "Well, what did you see attractive about Trump, or this or that?" And the number one thing people said was, "He's going to clean the swamp." and they thought that Hillary was part of the swamp. Okay, so that was a fairly logical conclusion on their part. And that happened a lot of times. And one particular, I was at my physician, and then I asked a nurse, and it happened to be a male nurse, and I asked him how he was going to vote, and he said, "Well, I can't vote for Hillary, so I'm going to vote for Trump." And this was after the election, and I said, "Well, how did you think?" And he said, "Well, you know, when you asked me that question, I never told you something. Had the alternative been Bernie Sanders and Trump, I would have voted for Bernie Sanders." And I've asked a lot of people that, and that makes me think that vote for Trump was pretty soft. It was really an anti-vote. It wasn't so much for him. That might be good news 2 years hence. And so therefore, I just want to say you came to give us a message from Bernie, and I'd like to, on the behalf of, I hope, some of us at least, give you a message. Tell Bernie to run in 2 years.
Well, thank you for that. I don't want to spoil the book for anybody, but the last 3 words in the book are "Run, Bernie, run." So,
okay. Do you see any opportunity for them to get rid of the Electoral College? Because, you know, Bernie lost by almost 3 million votes. I mean, Trump over Hillary. And it just seems to me that's ridiculous. And that's the second time in our history that that's happened.
No, and apropos of the earlier question, look, getting rid of the Electoral College would be a huge lift. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying we have to appreciate the huge lift. And I think at this particular moment, given the grassroots energy in this country, if we can mobilize and organize in all of these places where the secretary lost, where she should have won, I think we can turn this around.
The gentleman in the back wanted to know your opinion on the national popular vote effort as well.
Yes.
Yeah, so actually I know somebody who was working on that. Look, there are many ways to deal with this problem. That is obviously one of them. A lot of great ideas from, straight up repealing the Electoral College to this, this national popular vote program. My basic instinct in all this is, go out and organize people. We have to win the hearts and minds of people. We have to win the future. And the way we're going to do that is by winning people's support. Apropos of what you said about Bernie, would Bernie have won? I get this question a lot. Obviously, I get pushback from some people on this topic, but I think the evidence is overwhelming that Bernie would have won in 2016. The polling from mid-summer of 2015 was consistent from all the sources that Bernie did much better against Trump than Secretary Clinton did, and frankly against most of the other Republicans as well. One of Trump's pollsters a few months ago said on TV, Bernie would have beaten them. So Bernie would have beaten them. I think Trump's a little worried today. He went on a tirade actually against Bernie in one of his speeches. So we obviously have the president's attention.
Of course. You've touched on a lot of this. We're talking about establishment party candidates versus grassroots. And you mentioned earlier that there's been an alteration in the way we're going to be talking about super delegates. I was a Democratic precinct captain before the last election and became very disillusioned when I saw what was happening with super delegates and hearing the party chairman make an explanation, an excuse for the super delegates to say it was a good way to keep the grassroots people at bay. Okay? I considered grassroots, there were a lot of people that I convinced to register as Democrats so they could vote for Bernie, and somehow the pledge that I was asked to take, which was vote blue no matter who, just didn't seem to be a democratic way of doing things. We saw state after state after state where there was blatant election fraud in the primaries, and it got swept under the rugs because we were to vote blue no matter who, and the party was telling us who to vote for. I couldn't be a precinct captain under those circumstances. Now, you mentioned that there's been a change with superdelegates, and I think that's encouraging. I'm not sure that I'm prepared to totally explain that to people that I'm asking to vote for our party. And how can we be assured that the grassroots people who overwhelmingly, I have family members who voted for Bernie in the primary and they went and voted for Trump in the general election. Yeah, and it's like we're hardly on speaking terms anymore. But what can we do? How can you assure us that those people that are grassroots people, like a lot of the folks in this room, that we can see that the interests in those grassroots candidates are going to be supported by the party and by those other folks that we're trying to.
Yeah, no. I know the 2016 process left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. We working on behalf of Bernie and on this Unity Reform Commission that came out of the agreement we had with the Clinton campaign before the convention. This reform to superdelegates is substantial. The establishment has always said, well, the superdelegates have never overturned the will of the pledge delegates, the ones who are elected at the grassroots. But the truth of the matter is, I remember watching the TV before a single vote was cast in Iowa. They were putting up totals for Secretary Clinton, 300 delegates already. Iowa only has 46 pledge delegates, so you split those in Iowa, and she's up by 300 or 400 to something to 23. And I think it was dispiriting for a lot of people. People are like, why am I even bothering to participate when one candidate starts with such a lead? It's like playing a basketball game where you're like, okay, this team's coming out and they get a 100-point lead. and then let's start the game. And it'll be completely fair, but we're going to give them a 100-point lead, and that's what happened. Right. Well, the superdelegate rules have been changed. That changes was approved, and it was approved by a 3-to-1 margin at the DNC. Something I think people would not have thought possible just a couple years ago. And I got to tell the story. You know, I went with Bernie to the 2015 summer meeting of the DNC in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So we walked in, and it was like people were looking at like exotic animals from some other place. Like, who are these people? Let's get a look at him, like close up. And Bernie gave a great speech. Got, I thought, a reasonable response on all things considered. But I was just in the Chicago meeting of the DNC, and the culture at the DNC is very, very different now. You've got, you know, about 30% of the elected DNC members actually are Bernie people who were elected during the 2016 process. People ran in states all over the country during the caucus process and primary process. And having 30% of the people in the room at the DNC means necessarily they can't just ignore you like you've just come in from a spaceship from Mars, right? Because, you know, if you put 30% of this room was one group and 70% was the other, 70%, it's very hard to ignore the 30%. You're interacting with them, you're socializing with them, you're working with them. And so the culture there has, not to say there's not a lot of reforms that need to continue there, but I got to tell you, the culture at the DNC, in my experience, very different in 2018 than it was in 2015.
So how do we explain the following? When you have two candidates running an election, when you have Trump and you have Hillary running, if you do not vote for Hillary, you're actually supporting Trump. It's a really simple mathematical thing, but I can't tell you how many people I've met who said, oh, you know, I just didn't like her, and so I voted for, you know, my dog or whatever.
No, look, you know, elections are mostly binary in this country. You know, we have a system that lends itself to two parties. You know, other democracies have systems that are set up that lend themselves to more smaller, ideologically homogenous parties, right? I mean, our system lends itself, the first past the post system based on a geographic division lends itself to two parties. And, you know, so both parties are necessarily coalitions of sorts. And so there's not going to be ideological unanimity in the Democratic Party like there is, say, in the Labour Party in England, although even that party doesn't have unanimity, believe me. You know, other countries, in Italy, say, where you have like multiple parties and you have fairly ideologically homogenous parties, you're just not going to have that. The question is, what is the dominant ideology in the Democratic Party? Is it going to be the sort of corporatist experiment that we've had the last 20 years, which has been a failure? Or are we going to get back to the historical roots of the Democratic Party and have the progressive wing of the party leading us to victory all across the country? That's the sort of question. Will there be moderates running in the party and present in the party? Yes, there will be, right? And we have a primary process now. We have a primary process where we go out and have this debate. And, you know, I'm a big believer in primaries. I hear all the time people like, oh, why do we have these divisive primaries? And the primaries are a very important tool for sending signals, messages from the grassroots to the leadership in the party. Beyond party elections, it's another way in which the grassroots instructs the party on how the party should go. And when we nominate progressives in the primary process, that signals Tom Perez and the rest of the members of the DNC that that's where the grassroots of this party is, and you have to listen to that. So I encourage people to engage in primaries, to run primaries, run them vigorously, run on the issues. Like, I'm not a big fan of, you know, negative campaigning in particular. Although, you know, it's fair to do contrast with your opponent, I think. But, you know, we've got to have these policy-focused, hard-fought primaries. We got to elect progressives. We got to send a signal to the party leadership that we want the dominant ideology of the party to be a progressive one.
Yeah, in terms of the campaign that Bernie ran against Hillary and everything, Bernie, we heard him speak a bunch of times, and he said, we are going to have a contested convention. We're going to take our battle right to the convention, and we're going to contest it. And then Bernie met with Barack Obama and Chuck Schumer, and then from some of our friends who were at the convention, he really backed down, and supposedly the first roll call may have even been going for Bernie, and Bernie was very meek, where during the whole campaign, we're going to have a contested convention, and then it just fizzled. I know you know the inside scoop.
I do know the inside scoop, but there was no first ballot where Bernie was winning. I can guarantee you that. Believe me, if we could have gone into the convention with a reasonable chance of there being another outcome than the outcome there was, I myself would have been a major proponent of going in and having a knockdown, drag-out fight in the convention. I can just tell you that the possibility of that was zero. We didn't have. She had more pledged delegates than we did. She had all the super delegates. There is no way to win in that environment. Like, if there were 10 people here who get to vote in an election, and 8 of them are over there, and 2 of them are over there, and these people are pledged to vote a certain way, the 2 people are going to lose. Like, that's just mathematics. There was no way to win unless we could have converted a lot of super delegates, and people saw me on TV saying, we're going to flip a bunch of super delegates. Well, we did try to do that, but to do that, we would have had to won certain races at the end of the primary process, which we did not win. We did not win in California, for instance. For a lot of reasons, but we didn't win in California, right? And actually, the Associated Press has a lot to do with that, calling the election for Hillary Clinton the night before the California primary. You may all have remembered that occurrence. But when you go in, it's mathematics. There are X number of voters at the convention. There are her voters. She had more than we did by a substantial margin, frankly, when you add the super delegates in. And so there was no way to, quote unquote, contest it in the way that you're talking about. But what Bernie did do is he used his broad base of support to get substantial concessions from Secretary Clinton on a bunch of policy issues that are important to America. So they came together around a college education plan, which sort of was a marriage of both of their plans. A version of that plan has been partially enacted in New York. A bunch of other places around the country are looking at it. She made a bunch of concessions on health care. If she had been elected, and frankly, all of us, I was one of the people that thought Trump could win, but like everybody else, I thought that she would win, right? And she was going to be president of the United States. He was going to be a United States senator. He had a progressive agenda, and I firmly believe, and based on my experience with them in terms of dealing with reform in the party, that if they made a deal, they would keep it. And Bernie made a lot of policy advances with Secretary Clinton. Obviously, the platform, as you know, was the most progressive platform in the history of the Democratic Party. They made a number of concessions on electoral reforms, which even without Hillary Clinton as president, we have been able to get passed through the DNC. So Bernie used the considerable leverage that people at the grassroots had given him to advance the policy agenda of the progressive movement. Because Bernie says this, but it's really true. Like, I've known the guy for 30 plus years, right? It's really not about him. He talks about issues. If you've heard him on the stump, he really doesn't tell you any personal stories about Bernie growing up, Bernie's cat. Bernie doesn't have a cat, by the way. But you don't hear those kind of stories from Bernie. You got an hour and 45-minute, fairly, animated, but fairly, policy-driven speech on a host of issues. The speech started at an hour and 20 minutes. By the end of the campaign, it was an hour and 45 minutes or 2 hours, one issue after another about progressive policies in America. That's what the guy cares about, enacting policies to move the country forward. So it was about him going to the convention and grandstanding and yelling at Hillary Clinton, and when there was no possibility of winning the nomination. Why not use the power that he had, the leverage that he had, that you all had given him to advance the agenda that you fight for every day when you're knocking on doors in neighborhoods around Florida? And that's what he did. I think he did the right thing. Believe me, if there had been a chance that we could have, of any kind of chance of winning the nomination, we would have gone for it. There was no chance.
You mentioned voters who think their vote doesn't matter. How do you address that, and how do you motivate them?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's a perennial question, not just among progressives, but among people of all political stripes, frankly. And I think part of the way you do that is by nominating candidates who are going to inspire people to come out. Like, a lot of people came out for Bernie, who either never voted before or had not voted in a long, long time. You see it with Andrew Gillum as well. You need candidates who are going to inspire people. This has been one of the problems with a sort of more corporatist bent in the Democratic Party, sort of neoliberal bent. It's just not inspiring. No one wants to come out for sort of corporate America, right? Republicans know that too, and so they use a lot of wedge issues and racism and other things to gin up voters to vote for them, because no one's coming out, no one's knocking on doors for corporate America, right? And so we have got to offer voters a clear choice with candidates that are authentic, that people believe And look, people aren't stupid. They understand that when you put forward a bold progressive message, you're going to be governor of Florida, you can be president. They know that you're not the king or the queen, and that you don't rule by fiat, and that the first day of your administration you're going to wave a magic wand and everything that you promised on the campaign is going to come true. People know that, but they want to know that you're going to fight for it, and you're going to get as much of it as you possibly can. And so when you see candidates like that, you see large numbers of voters who are either disaffected or dropped out, who aren't participating, come into the process. So we have got to keep nominating and then electing these candidates who are going to inspire Americans who have given up on the political process to come in and participate. And we are having success. The number of young people who are participating is going up. When they have a candidate who inspires them, if you would open your primaries, you'd have even more of them. But that's what we have to do. We have to lead by example. And you got to have people that people like, trust, and believe are going to be fighting for them. Because when someone runs for office, they're going to confront a whole bunch of issues that are never discussed in a campaign because no one knew this issue was coming up. People want to believe in their hearts that the person they're voting for is going to be looking out for them when these new issues come up. So that's what I said. Let's take a couple more and then I'll sign some books.
Well,
shake some hands. Whoa!
Oh, that was loud.
Okay.
Like well, what we're going to do, I want to introduce our local Our Revolution group, Progressive Sarasota.
Yay!
And give Deanna Dabble a chance to tell you what they're up to.